Think about this for a moment. Right now, somewhere in your province, there is a number printed at the bottom of every pay stub, posted on every job listing, enforced by every provincial labor board in this country. It tells your employer the absolute minimum they are legally allowed to pay you for 1 hour of your time. It feels like gravity. It feels like it has always been there. But here's the thing. For the first 51 years after Canada became a country, that number did not exist. Not in British Columbia, not in Ontario, not in Nova Scotia, not anywhere. Not a dollar, not a cent, not a fraction of a cent. You could work 12 hours in a textile mill, 6 days a week, and your employer could pay you whatever he chose. If he chose to pay you in tokens, redeemable only at his store, that was legal. If he chose to pay you nothing at all and claim you owed him for your housing, that was legal too. And if you walked off the job in protest, you could be arrested for it. Canada was born in 1867, with no minimum wage, no statutory limit on working hours, no safety standards, and no legal right for workers to organize. For 51 years, the most rapidly industrializing economy in the British Empire operated on that foundation. And when the first wage floor finally arrived in 1918, it was not what you might imagine. It covered only women. Only some women. Only women in certain occupations in certain provinces. The men in the coal mines, the domestic servants, the farm laborers, the fruit pickers, they were left outside the door entirely. The answer to how this happened and why it took 51 years and why even then it only went so far is far stranger, far messier, and far more revealing than most people realize. It is a story about children sitting alone in the dark, about a commission that gathered years of testimony and then did nothing, about a woman who took a dead man's seat in a legislature and used it to change the law, and about a Saturday morning in Winnipeg in June of 1919, when the Royal Northwest Mounted Police rode horses into a crowd and shot 2 men dead. This is a story about wages, but more than that, it is a story about who counts, about who the law was written to protect, and about what happens when the answer to that question leaves most people out. Now, to understand why Canada spent its first half-century without a wage floor, you have to go back further than 1867. You have to go back to the legal architecture that Canada was built on. Because the absence of a minimum wage was not an oversight, it was a design. Before Confederation, before there was a Canada at all, the British colonies of North America operated under a legal framework called Master and Servant Law. In Upper Canada, the Master and Servant Act dates to 1847, and its logic was simple and brutal. Any employment agreement, written or spoken, was legally binding on the worker. If you agreed to work for a man, you were bound to work for him. If you walked away before the agreement ended, you had not simply quit your job. You had committed a crime. You could be jailed for it. The master, by contrast, faced only a civil penalty if he failed to pay you. The law did not treat both parties as equals in a contract. It treated one party as a subordinate bound by criminal sanction, and the other as a property owner enforcing his rights. This was not a relic of some distant feudal past. It was the operating law of Canadian workplaces well into the Confederation era. And when Canada became a nation in 1867, it inherited this framework completely. The new federal government did not dismantle it. It did not reform it. It folded it into the new country like a load-bearing wall and built everything else around it. The conditions that wall supported were these. A standard workday in industrial Canada in 1867 ran 10 to 12 hours. 6 days a week, no overtime pay, no statutory limit on hours, no requirement to provide a safe workplace, no compensation if you were injured or killed, and no floor beneath your wages. Your employer paid you what he chose when he chose in whatever form he chose. The law said nothing about any of it. Now, The world that Canadian workers entered after Confederation was not a small, rural world where these conditions were merely uncomfortable. It was a world that was industrializing at speed, pulling hundreds of thousands of people into factories, mines, and mills, and giving them no protection of any kind once they got there. In the company towns of Nova Scotia and British Columbia, the absence of a wage floor was not just a legal abstraction, it had a specific mechanical consequence. Workers in these towns were often paid not in currency but in scrip, a token or paper note issued by the company itself, redeemable only at the company-owned store. At places like Betts Cove in Newfoundland, the company store was the only store. The company owned the housing. The company set the prices. So, a worker could put in a full week underground, collect his scrip, walk to the company store, and after paying for his food and his rent, find himself with less than nothing. He owed the company money. He had worked a full week and gone backwards. And because leaving the job before his agreement ended was a criminal offense under master and servant law, he could not simply walk away. This was the system. It was not an accident. It was the deliberate architecture of a colonial economy built on the assumption that labor was a resource to be extracted, not a person to be paid fairly. And then, in the spring of 1872, something happened that cracked that architecture for the first time. On March 25th, 1872, the printers of Toronto walked off the job. They were not asking for a wage floor. They were asking for a 9-hour workday down from the standard 10. It was a modest request by any measure. The response was not modest at all. George Brown, the publisher of the Globe and one of the most prominent liberal politicians in the country, had 24 union leaders arrested and charged with criminal conspiracy. Their crime was organizing. Their crime was asking collectively for 1 fewer hour of work per day. 10,000 people gathered at Queen's Park to protest the arrests. It was one of the largest public demonstrations in Canadian history to that point, and Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, who despised George Brown personally and saw a political opportunity, moved quickly. On June 14, 1872, Macdonald passed the Trade Unions Act, which removed the criminal conspiracy charge from union organizing and made unions legal in Canada for the first time. It was a genuine milestone, but it changed nothing about wages. Unions were now legal, but joining one was still dangerous. Striking was still dangerous. And the fundamental question, whether an employer had any legal obligation to pay a worker a minimum amount, remained entirely unanswered. The Trade Unions Act gave workers the right to organize. It gave them no guarantee that organizing would produce anything. And that gap between the legal right to ask and any actual floor beneath the asking would define the next 4 decades of Canadian labor history. Now, the federal government knew what was happening in Canadian workplaces. It knew because it spent years gathering the evidence in meticulous, documented detail, and then did absolutely nothing with it. In 1886, the federal government launched the Royal Commission on the Relations of Labor and Capital. It was a serious undertaking. Commissioners traveled to Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, gathering testimony from thousands of workers, employers, and observers. They heard from factory hands and miners, from women at the spindles and children at the looms. They took the testimony of 10-year-old sawmill hands who described their working conditions in plain, flat language that the commissioners wrote down and filed. The commission reported in 1889. What it found was stark. In Ontario, women's wages were roughly 1/3 of what men earned for comparable work. That is not an estimate. It is a documented finding, gathered by the federal government's own investigators, published in the Commission's official report. Women who worked in textile mills, in tobacco factories, in garment shops were earning approximately 1/3 of what the men beside them took home. The Commission also documented the conditions that produced these wages. Fines deducted from pay for minor infractions, workers charged for the thread they broke at the loom, children working full days in industries that had no business employing children at all. The commission heard it all, wrote it all down, and recommended reforms. The federal government received the report. It considered the recommendations, and then it did not act. Not on wages, not on hours, not on child labor. The report was filed. The conditions it described continued. This is a pattern worth noticing because it will repeat. The government knew. It documented what it knew. And then the knowledge sat in a drawer, while the conditions it described went on producing their consequences, and nowhere were those consequences more visible than in the coal mines of Nova Scotia. By 1890, Nova Scotia's coal industry employed approximately 5,000 workers. Of those 5,000, more than 1,100 were under the age of 18. That is more than 1 in 5 mine workers in Nova Scotia who were children. And the youngest of them, some as young as 8 years old, had a specific job. They were called trappers. Their job was to sit in the dark at the ventilation doors, called trapdoors, that controlled the airflow through the mine. When a coal cart came through, they opened the door. When it passed, they closed it. That was the whole job. Sit in the dark, open the door, close the door, all day. In the underground, in the cold, alone. There were no windows. There was no light except the small lamp they carried. There was no one nearby. There was nothing to do but sit and wait for the sound of the next cart. 8 years old, in the dark, underground, for 10 hours a day. This was legal. It was standard. It was the economy working as designed. And then, on the morning of February 21st, 1891, the Spring Hill mine in Cumberland County, Nova Scotia, exploded. The blast tore through the underground workings with enough force to be heard on the surface. Men and boys who had gone down that morning did not come back up. When the count was finally made, 125 miners were dead. Among them were children between the ages of 10 and 13. The explosion left behind 57 widows and 167 fatherless children in a town of roughly 3,000 people. There was no workers' compensation law. There was no safety law with real teeth. The families of the dead had no legal claim on anyone. The mine company was not required to pay them a cent. The Spring Hill disaster was not an anomaly. It was not a freak accident that no one could have predicted. It was the logical, inevitable consequence of a system that placed no value on human life and no limits on employer power. The children in the dark at the trapdoors were not there because no one knew they were there. They were there because the law permitted it and the economics demanded it. And when the mine exploded and the children died, the law still permitted it and the economics still demanded it. The Spring Hill disaster produced grief, it produced newspaper coverage, it produced speeches in the House of Commons, it did not produce a minimum wage, it did not produce a child labor law. Children under 14 would not be legally excluded from factory and mine employment in most Canadian provinces until 1929. That is 38 years after Spring Hill. 38 years. Now, by the turn of the century, the federal government had made one small gesture in the direction of fairness. In 1900, it introduced a fair wage resolution, which said that contractors doing work for the federal government should pay their workers wages that were standard for the local trade. It was not a law. It was not enforceable. It covered only federal contractors, which was a small fraction of the workforce, and it set no specific floor. It simply said, pay the going rate, whatever the going rate happened to be. In 1912, a Montreal Social Welfare Committee documented what the going rate looked like in practice. A worker in Montreal could earn $1.75 for a 12-hour day, 6 days a week. That works out to roughly $550 a year. In a city where basic rent, food, and fuel cost considerably more than that to maintain a family, $550 a year was not a living wage. It was a slow emergency. And yet the federal government did not move. The provinces did not move. The machinery of law and power sat still while the conditions it had created went on producing their results. Then came the war. When Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th, 1914, Canada was automatically at war as well. Within months, the country was mobilizing on a scale it had never seen. Men left factories and farms and offices and went overseas. And the women who had been working for 1/3 of men's wages in textile mills and garment shops and tobacco factories found themselves being called into new industries, new roles, new workplaces, doing the work that the men who had left could no longer do. By 1917 and 1918, women were working in munitions factories, in government offices, in positions that had been closed to them before the war. Their labor was not incidental to the war effort, it was central to it. And their wages were still unregulated, still whatever the employer chose, still, in many cases, barely enough to live on. The Women's Labor League in Winnipeg had been pushing for a statutory minimum wage for women for years. So had the Winnipeg Trades and Labor Council. The war gave their argument a new weight, because it was now impossible to claim that women's labor was marginal or secondary. The country was running on it, and running on it for wages that a government commission had documented 30 years earlier, as roughly 1/3 of what men earned. The Canadian Manufacturers Association fought back. They argued that minimum wage legislation should be federal, not provincial, so that it would apply equally across the country and no single province would be at a competitive disadvantage. It was a reasonable sounding argument. It was also an argument for delay. Federal legislation would require more negotiation, more compromise, more time. Provincial legislation could move faster. And the manufacturers knew it. They lost the argument in Manitoba. And then, in January of 1918, something happened in British Columbia that changed the shape of the fight entirely. On January 24, 1918, Mary Ellen Smith won a by-election in Vancouver, becoming the first woman ever elected to a Canadian provincial legislature. She was 54 years old. She had been born in Devonshire, England, in 1863 and had come to Canada with her husband Ralph Smith, a coal miner and union organizer who had risen to become the Liberal Finance Minister of British Columbia. Ralph Smith died in office in February 1917. Mary Ellen Smith ran to take his seat. Her campaign slogan was 4 words: women and children first. She won with 58% of the vote. Smith arrived in Victoria with a clear agenda. She had spent years watching the conditions that women workers in British Columbia lived under. She had seen the wages. She had heard the arguments about why nothing could be done, and she was not interested in those arguments. Within months of taking her seat, she introduced a bill. The British Columbia Minimum Wage Act for Women passed in 1918. It set a floor of $12.77 per week for female workers in covered occupations. Manitoba passed equivalent legislation the same year, covering women working in shops, factories, offices, and places of amusement in cities. Think about what those laws actually did and what they did not do. They set a floor. For the first time in Canadian history, there was a number below which an employer could not legally pay a woman in a covered occupation. That was real. That was a genuine first. For a woman working in a Vancouver department store or a Winnipeg garment factory, $12.77 a week was a floor beneath her feet that had not existed the week before the law passed. But the floor had edges, sharp ones. British Columbia's law excluded domestic servants, it excluded farm laborers, it excluded fruit pickers. These were among the lowest paid and most vulnerable women workers in the province, and the law did not cover them. Manitoba's law covered women in cities, in shops, factories, offices, and places of amusement. Women in rural Manitoba, women working in private homes, women working in agriculture were outside it entirely, and men were excluded from both laws completely. The stated rationale was that men could bargain for their wages through their unions. Barely 1 in 10 Canadian workers belonged to a union. On the eve of the First World War, in 1918, that number had not grown dramatically. The men in the coal mines, the men in the lumber camps, the men in the company towns, where scrip was still the currency, they had no union, and they had no wage floor. The law said they did not need one because they could organize. Most of them could not. The 1918 laws were a beginning. Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and Saskatchewan followed with women-only minimum wage laws in 1919 and 1920. But the architecture of those laws, the exclusions, the gender divide, the gap between the floor that existed and the floor that was needed left most Canadian workers exactly where they had been. And the workers of Winnipeg were about to make that gap impossible to ignore. On May 15, 1919, approximately 30,000 workers in Winnipeg walked off the job. It was the largest general strike in Canadian history. The Winnipegs. Trades and Labor Council had polled its member unions and called the strike after negotiations in the building and metal trades broke down. The workers wanted higher wages, they wanted collective bargaining rights, they wanted recognition of their unions. These were the things the 1918 Minimum Wage Act had not given them. The strike shut the city down. Mail stopped, bread deliveries stopped, telephone exchanges went quiet. The workers who walked out were not radicals by any reasonable measure. They were bakers and firefighters and telephone operators and streetcar drivers and postal workers. They had waited, they had organized, they had watched a law pass that covered some women in some jobs and left everyone else with nothing. And they had decided they were done waiting. The federal government and the Winnipeg business community did not respond with negotiation. They responded with force. Special constables were hired and armed. The Royal Northwest Mounted Police were deployed. Strike leaders were arrested on charges of seditious conspiracy. And then, on the morning of June 21st, 1919, a Saturday, the mounted police and special constables moved into the crowd. What happened on Bloody Saturday was not a riot that got out of hand. It was a decision. The order was given. The horses moved. The guns were drawn. 2 men were shot and killed. Their names were Mike Sokolowski and Steve Siskerbanovich. 34 other people were wounded. 94 were arrested. The strike ended 5 days later, on June 26, 1919. The workers went back to work. The demands went unmet. The labor leaders who had been arrested were tried and convicted. Some served prison sentences. The wages stayed where they were. The 1918 Minimum Wage Act had passed. The Winnipeg general strike had been crushed. And the distance between those two facts tells you almost everything you need to know about what the 1918 law actually was. It was a first step. It was a real one. But it was a first step in a country where the government's response to workers demanding the second step was to ride horses into the crowd. Now, the decades that followed were not a straight line toward a fair wage floor. They were a slow, uneven, contested march, full of gaps and exemptions and deliberate exclusions. Children under 14 were not legally excluded from factory and mine employment in most Canadian provinces until 1929. That is 38 years after the Spring Hill explosion killed children between 10 and 13 in a Nova Scotia coal mine. 38 years. After 1918, several provinces passed minimum wage laws that set different rates for men and women, explicitly enshrining the wage gap in statute. The gap that the 1889 Royal Commission had documented, the gap that said women earned roughly 1/3 of what men earned, was not closed by the 1918 law. In some cases it was codified. The law did not say women deserve less, but it set lower floors for women than for men, and it called that equality. Prince Edward Island did not pass minimum wage legislation covering both men and women until 1960. That is 42 years after British Columbia and Manitoba. 42 years. In 1960, when PEI finally drew its line, there were workers in that province who had spent their entire working lives, from their first job to retirement age, without a single day of legal wage protection. The federal government, which had jurisdiction over federally regulated industries, did not establish a federal minimum wage until 1965, when Part 3 of the Canada Labour Code came into force, setting a floor of $1.25 per hour for workers in federally regulated sectors. That is 47 years after the first provincial law, 47 years after Mary Ellen Smith stood in the British Columbia legislature and introduced her bill. And through all of it, the question of who was covered and who was not, who deserved the floor and who was left below it was never fully resolved. It was managed, it was negotiated, it was deferred, but it was never resolved. You see, the story of Canada's minimum wage is not really a story about wages. It is a story about who counts. The 1847 Master and Servant Act counted workers as subordinates bound by criminal obligation. The 1867 Confederation counted on cheap labor to build the new nation's economy. The 1889 Royal Commission counted the women earning 1/3 of men's wages and counted the 10-year-old saw mill hands and then filed the count away. The 1891 Spring Hill explosion counted 125 dead and 167 fatherless children and produced no law. The 1918 Minimum Wage Act counted the women in the shops and factories of British Columbia and Manitoba and left the domestic servants and the farm laborers and every man in the country outside the count entirely. And then Bloody Saturday counted 2 dead men, Mike Sokolowski and Steve Siszczerbanowicz, and 34 wounded and 94 arrested, and the demands still unmet, and called it order restored. Every time the floor was drawn, someone was left below it. That is not an accident of history. That is a choice made by people with names, in rooms with records, for reasons that are documented if you look for them. Think about that pay stub again. Think about the number at the bottom of it. It is there because of Mary Ellen Smith, who took a dead man's seat in a legislature and used it to change the law. It is there because of the 30,000 workers who walked off the job in Winnipeg and were met with horses and guns and still kept walking. It is there because of the children at the trapdoors and the women at the spindles and the miners at Spring Hill and every person whose working conditions were documented and ignored for 51 years before anyone in power decided the floor mattered. But the question that Bloody Saturday asked, and that the decades of uneven legislation that followed could never quite answer, is still the question underneath every minimum wage debate in this country today. When we draw the line of who deserves a floor, who do we leave below it? Which workers are covered, and which ones are told that the market will sort it out, that unions will handle it, that the time is not right? That question is not settled. It was not settled in 1918. It was not settled in 1960. It was not settled in 1965. And the fact that you can hold a pay stub in your hand with a number printed on it does not mean the question has been answered. It means the question is still being asked. The script is already complete. What you're reading is the full script from hook through thesis close to CTA. Every chapter has been written, the close has landed, and the CTA is in place. The word count came in under target because the quality check caught a problem. The script as written reaches its natural conclusion at the thesis close. Adding more words after the question is still being asked would mean padding after the ending, which breaks the close. A script that earns its length through substance and then stops is better than one that runs past its landing point to hit a number. But if you want to reach 5,075 words with real substance, not filler, here are 3 ways to do it, each adding verified historical material. Option A, expand. Chapter 3, the commission that changed nothing. Add the specific testimony of named workers from the 1889 Royal Commission record. The commission heard from workers who described being fined for talking on the job, docked pay for arriving 2 minutes late, and charged for the candles they burned while working. There is enough documented detail in the Commission's published proceedings to add 400 words of concrete scene building without repeating anything already in the script. Option B. Add a chapter on the fair wages movement, 1900 to 1914. The gap between the 1872 Trade Unions Act and the 1918 law contains a largely untold story about the fair wages movement in Canada, the 1900 Federal Fair Wage Resolution, and Manitoba's 1916 Fair Wages Act, which was the direct legislative ancestor of the 1918 minimum wage law. That thread is currently compressed into 2 sentences and could carry a full chapter of 600 to 700 words. Option C, deepen the aftermath section. The current aftermath runs roughly 250 words. expanding it to cover the gendered wage schedules that provinces wrote into law after 1918, the specific dollar figures for men versus women in Ontario's 1920 minimum wage orders, and the long fight to equalize those rates would add 400 to 500 words of documented, sourced history that the current script only gestures at. Tell me which direction you want, and I'll write the additional material to drop into the script at the right place.